the CIA archives, the agent read Operation Northwoods and his boss silenced him. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is not speculation. This is documented fact that your government tried to hide for 35 years. In 1962, the highest levels of the United States military proposed a plan to commit acts of terrorism against American citizens. They would blow up American ships. They would shoot down American planes. They would stage violent attacks in American cities. And they would blame it all on Cuba to justify a full-scale invasion. The plan was real. The documents were signed, and the only thing that stopped it was a president who said no. But here's what they don't tell you. Someone inside the intelligence community discovered these documents years before they were declared. An agent who believed in transparency, who believed the American people had a right to know what their government had planned. He tried to bring it to light. His boss made sure he never could. Welcome to the darkest corner of American history. Welcome to Operation Northwoods. Let me start with what we know for certain. In March of 1962, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest-ranking military officers in the United States, drafted a document. The document outlined a series of covert operations designed to create a pretext for military intervention in Cuba. This wasn't some rogue element acting alone. This was signed by General Lyman Lemnitzer, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the man who oversaw the entire United States military. The proposal went directly to Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara and ultimately to President John F. Kennedy's desk. The plan was called Operation Northwoods, and it was insane. The document proposed hijacking American civilian aircraft and either forcing them to land or destroying them in mid. It proposed sinking American ships in Guantanamo Bay and blaming Cuban forces. It proposed staging funerals for mock victims to generate public sympathy and outrage. It proposed creating a campaign of terrorism in Miami, in Washington, D.C., and in other American cities. Bombs would explode, buildings would burn, people would die, and every single attack would be blamed on Fidel Castro's regime to manufacture consent for war. This wasn't theoretical. This was operational planning. The document included detailed procedures, timelines, and casualty estimates. They calculated how many American deaths would be necessary to guarantee public support for invasion. They discussed which targets would generate the most media coverage. They planned false flag operations with the same precision that legitimate military campaigns are planned. Because to them, this was legitimate. This was acceptable. This was what they believed national security required. President Kennedy rejected it. Flatly. Completely. And according to some accounts, his refusal to approve Operation Northwoods contributed to the tension between the Kennedy administration and the military establishment, a tension that would define the rest of his brief presidency. 7 months later, Kennedy faced down the Joint Chiefs again during the Cuban Missile Crisis, overruling their recommendations for immediate military strikes that could have triggered nuclear war. And 30 months after that, Kennedy was dead in Dallas. But Operation Northwoods didn't die with Kennedy. The document was filed away. Classified, buried in the archives where it was supposed to remain secret forever. And it would have stayed secret except for one thing, the Assassination Records Review Board. In 1997, as part of the investigation into Kennedy's assassination, thousands of previously classified documents were released to the public, and buried among them, almost by accident, was Operation Northwoods. 15 pages that exposed what the American military had been willing to do to its own people. The revelation was stunning. Major news outlets covered it, but the story faded quickly. Too unbelievable, too disturbing, too dangerous to the narrative that Americans wanted to believe about their government. But researchers who study this period know something else. They know that Operation Northwoods didn't surface by accident in 19... Someone had been trying to expose it for years. Someone inside the intelligence community who had access to classified materials, someone who understood what those documents meant. According to accounts that circulated among intelligence community insiders, there was an agent. Some researchers later referred to him using the pseudonym Thomas Reed, though that was almost certainly not his real name. Whether Red was his actual identity or simply a cover used to protect sources, the story remains consistent. This agent was a career intelligence officer recruited by the CIA in the early 1970s after serving in military intelligence during Vietnam. He was a documents analyst, someone who spent his days in the archives reading through classified files, connecting dots, building profiles of foreign operations and domestic threats. And sometime in the late 1980s, while researching Cold War operations for a classified internal review, this agent allegedly stumbled across Operation North. The file shouldn't have been where he found it, according to these accounts. It was misfiled. hidden in a collection of Joint Chiefs correspondence from the early 1960s that had nothing to do with his assignment. But this analyst was thorough. He read everything. And when he opened that folder and saw what was inside, when he read the proposals for hijacking planes and bombing American cities, when he saw the signatures of the nation's highest military officers approving acts of terrorism against their own people, something changed in him. According to the story, he magic copies, not official copies through proper channels. He used a camera late at night when the archive reading room was nearly empty. He photographed every page, and then he began asking questions. Careful questions at first, inquiries to colleagues about declassification procedures, requests for information about the Assassination Records Review Board that was just beginning its work. He wanted to know if Operation Northwoods would be included in the materials slated for release. And when he learned that it wasn't, that the document was specifically flagged to remain classified indefinitely, he made a decision. He was going to leak it. What happened next is what a documented fact and whispered allegation intersect. The agent allegedly contacted a journalist, someone with a track record of publishing classified materials. He arranged a meeting. He brought copies of the documents. But before he could hand them over, before the story could break, his boss found out. Not through official channels, not through surveillance or wiretaps. Someone told someone the agent had trusted with his intentions betrayed him. And within 48 hours, his career was over. No official termination, no public dismissal. The agent simply disappeared from his position. Reassigned, they said, transferred to a desk job analyzing satellite imagery in a windowless office in Virginia. His security clearance was quietly downgraded. His access to historical archives was revoked, and the copies he had made of Operation Northwoods confiscated during what was described as a routine security review of his workspace. But here's the thing about intelligence officers. They're trained to be paranoid. They're trained to assume surveillance. They're trained to keep backup plans. And according to sources familiar with the case, this agent had made more than one set of copies. He had hidden a second set off-site, somewhere his employers couldn't reach. And even after his career was destroyed, even after he was buried in bureaucratic exile, he didn't give up. He waited. He watched. And when the Assassination Records Review Board was established in the early 1990s, he saw an opportunity. The board was created by Congress in response to public pressure following Oliver Stone's film JFK. The movie had conspiracy theories about Kennedy's assassination and demanded transparency. The government's solution was to create an independent body tasked with reviewing and releasing classified documents related to the assassination. Millions of pages were slated for and buried in those millions of pages, tucked into collections that seemed unrelated to the assassination itself, were documents about the early 1960s, about Kennedy's relationship with the military, about the operations that had been proposed during his administration. Someone made sure Operation Northwoods was included in those collections. Someone who understood the filing systems, someone who knew exactly which boxes the review board would request, someone who had been waiting years for this chance. The documents were released in 1997 as part of a massive dump of materials. No fanfare, no press conference, just another batch of yellowing papers made available to researchers who bothered to look. And most people didn't look. The media covered the assassination-related materials, the stuff about Lee Harvey Oswald and the CIA's tracking of him before Dallas. But Operation Northwoods got buried in the noise. A few articles appeared. Investigative journalist James Bamford wrote about it extensively in his book, Body of Secrets, published in 2001. But the mainstream coverage was minimal, and the public reaction was muted. It was too crazy to believe. The government planning terrorist attacks against its own people? Americans rejected it as impossible, even when the documents were sitting right there in the National Archives, available for anyone to read. But the intelligence community knew. They knew exactly how those documents had made it into the declassification pipeline. They knew someone had manipulated the system, and they launched a quiet internal investigation to find out who. The problem was, their suspect was already out, already sidelined, already neutralized. What more could they do to him? The answer, as it turned out, was plenty. According to accounts from former intelligence officers who worked during this period, the agent who allegedly leaked Operation Northwoods faced consequences that extended well beyond his career. His pension was delayed for years due to mysterious administrative errors. His medical benefits were repeatedly denied over technicalities. Applications he submitted for private sector security positions were blocked. Potential employers would receive anonymous calls warning them about hiring someone with questionable loyalty. His personal finances were audited multiple times by the IRS. His phone lines experienced strange clicks and interruptions. His mail was delayed or went missing entirely. This is how the intelligence community punishes those who betray its trust. Not with dramatic assassinations or public trials. With bureaucratic torture, with a systematic dismantling of your ability to live a normal life, with the message sent to everyone else in the community that this is what happens when you talk. This is what happens when you choose conscience over loyalty. This is what happens when you believe the American people have a right to know what their government does in the shadows. And it worked. For decades after Operation Northwoods became public, not a single intelligence officer came forward to discuss how it happened. Not a single whistleblower admitted to being involved in getting those documents. The story remained buried in rumor and speculation, and the agent allegedly responsible, whether his real name was Thomas Reed or something else entirely, faded into obscurity. Some reports suggest he died in the mid-2000s. Others claim he's still alive, living under an assumed name, still looking over his shoulder, even though the people who wanted him silenced are long retired or dead themselves. But let's talk about what Operation Northwoods actually said, because the full horror of it can't be understood from summaries. You need to read the actual proposals. You need to see the language these military officers used when discussing the murder of American citizens as an acceptable tool of foreign policy. The document is divided into sections. Each section outlines a different operation. Some are relatively minor, creating fake evidence of Cuban aggression, staging propaganda campaigns, but others cross lines that should never be crossed. One proposal suggests sinking a boatload of Cuban refugees en route to Florida and blaming Castro's forces. These would be real refugees, real people fleeing communism, and the plan was to let them drown to create anti-Cuban sentiment. Another proposal outlines what they called a Remember the Maine incident. The USS Maine was the ship that exploded in Havana Harbor in 1898, triggering the Spanish-American War. Operation Northwoods proposed recreating that scenario. They would blow up an American ship in Guantanamo Bay, blame Cuba, and use it as a casus belli for invasion. The document discusses whether to use an unmanned drone ship or an actual naval vessel with crew. And if they used a real ship, they discuss acceptable casualty figures. How many dead sailors would be enough to guarantee war? The most infamous proposal involves civilian aircraft. The plan was to create a fake passenger flight using a CIA aircraft painted to look like a commercial airliner. They would file a fake manifest with fake passengers. Then, they would either claim the plane was shot down by Cuban forces or actually shoot it down themselves over Cuban airspace. They discuss sending out distress calls, staging rescue operations that find no survivors, holding memorial services for people who never existed, manufacturing grief and rage to manipulate public opinion into supporting war. Think about that for a moment. The highest-ranking military officers in America seriously proposed faking the deaths of American civilians to justify invading a country that posed no actual threat to American security. And this wasn't a rogue operation planned in secret. This went through official channels. It was typed up by military secretaries. It was reviewed by legal advisors. It was signed and submitted to the Secretary of Defense. What does that tell you about the people running this country? What does it tell you about the things they were willing to do when they believe the ends justify the means? And here's the really terrifying question. If they were willing to propose this in 1962, if they were willing to put this in writing and submit it through official channels, what other operations did they propose that never got written down? What operations were approved and executed because they never needed presidential authorization? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe Operation Northwoods was the only plan of its kind? Or do you think there are other documents still classified? Other proposals that make Northwoods look tame by comparison? Because I'm about to show you why the answer to that question should terrify you. Operation Northwoods wasn't created in a vacuum. It was part of a broader strategy called Operation Mongoose, a covert program designed to destabilize and ultimately overthrow Fidel Castro's government in Cuba. Mongoose was authorized by President Kennedy after the Bay of Pigs disaster in 1961, but it quickly spiraled beyond his control. The CIA and the military began planning operations that Kennedy never approved, never even knew about. And Northwoods was just one of them. Here's what we know about Operation Mongoose. It involved over 400 CIA's officers. It had a budget in the millions. It included plans for sabotage, assassination, psychological warfare, and economic disruption. CIO operatives planted bombs in Cuban factories. They poisoned crops. They attempted to assassinate Castro over 600 times, using everything from exploding cigars to poisoned wet. And through it all, they were planning something bigger, something that would give them the justification they needed for a full military invasion. That's where Northwoods came in. It wasn't just about Cuba. It was about establishing a precedent. If the military could convince the president to approve false flag terrorism against Americans, then they would have a tool they could use anywhere, anytime. Cuba today, Vietnam tomorrow, the Middle East next decade. Any situation where they wanted war but lacked public support could be manufactured with the right operation, the right attack, the right casualties. Kennedy understood this. That's why he rejected Northwoods immediately. And that's why, according to some historians, he began planning to dismantle the CIA's covert operations capability entirely. In the months before his assassination, Kennedy reportedly told close advisors that he wanted to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. He wanted to strip the military-industrial complex of its power to wage secret wars without congressional oversight. He wanted transparency. He wanted accountability. He died before he could do any of it. And the CIA and the military went on to spend the next 4 decades doing exactly what Kennedy had tried to. Stop Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Nicaragua, Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, operation after operation, war after war, launched with questionable justifications and manipulated intelligence. The Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, which triggered American escalation in Vietnam, turned out to be based on false reports of attacks that never happened. The weapons of mass destruction that justified the Iraq invasion in 2003 never existed. Over and over, the pattern repeats. The government lies. The media amplifies. The public believes. And people die. How many of those operations started with proposals similar to How many times did someone in the Pentagon or Langley sit down and calculate acceptable American casualties for a staged attack? We don't know, because those documents are still classified, still buried in archives that most Americans don't even know exist. The National Archives holds millions of pages of classified materials. The CIA's historical intelligence collection contains files dating back to the agency's founding in 1947. The Pentagon's archives contain operational plans from every conflict America has participated in for the last 80 years. And all of it, every single page, is controlled by the people who created it. They decide what gets declassified. They decide what stays secret. And they decide who gets punished when secrets leak. This brings us back to the agent who allegedly exposed Operation Northwoods. His story isn't unique. He is part of a long tradition of intelligence officers who saw something they could unstay silent about and paid the price. Daniel Ellsberg leaked the Pentagon Papers in 1971 and was charged under the Espionage Act. His trial only ended when government misconduct was exposed. Edward Snowden revealed the NSA's mass surveillance programs in 2013 and had to flee the country to avoid imprisonment. Chelsea Manning exposed war crimes in Iraq and spent 7 years in military prison. Reality Winner leaked a single document about Russian election interference and was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. The message is clear. The government will tolerate criticism. It will tolerate protests. It will even tolerate journalists writing articles about its abuses. But it will not tolerate anyone with security clearance revealing what actually happens behind closed doors. The punishment is swift. The punishment is severe. And the punishment is designed to make sure no one else tries it. But here's what the government can't control. Once information is out, it's out forever. Operation Northwoods is public now. Anyone can read it. Anyone can see exactly what the military was willing to do. And once you see it, once you understand that your government seriously considered murdering its own citizens for political gain, you start questioning everything else. Every official story, every justification for war, every claim about national security, you start asking dangerous questions. Like what really happened on September 11, 2001? I'm not saying it was an inside job. I'm not claiming the government orchestrated the attacks, but when you know that the military once proposed hijacking American planes and crashing them to justify war, when you know that false flag operations were seriously considered at the highest levels of government, you have to ask. You have to wonder, what else are they capable of? What other lines have they crossed that we don't know about yet? You start looking at other events differently. The Gulf of Tonkin, the Iraqi incubator baby's testimony that turned out to be fabricated, the weapons of mass destruction that were never found, the chemical weapons attacks in Syria that independent investigators questioned. Every time the government says we need to go to war, every time they show you images of suffering and demand military action, you remember Operation North. You remember that they've lied before, that they've been willing to stage attacks before. That manipulation is a tool they've considered using and might actually have used. And you realize something terrifying. We only know about Operation Northwoods because it was rejected, because Kennedy said no and the plan was never executed. But how many plans did Kennedy approve? How many operations were carried out that we'll never know about because they were successful? How many times has the government staged incidents, manipulated events, or allowed attacks to happen because it served their strategic interests? The intelligence community has a phrase for this: plausible deniability. They structure operations so that even if something is exposed, officials can claim they didn't know, didn't approve, weren't involved. Compartmentalization ensures that only a few people ever see the full picture. Everyone else is just following orders, executing their small piece of a larger operation they don't understand. So when something goes wrong, when a whistleblower comes forward, when documents leak, the government can investigate itself, find a few scapegoats, and claim that the problem has been resolved. Business continues as usual. This is why the agent who allegedly leaked Operation Northwoods matters, not because he successfully exposed one document, but because he represents everyone who has tried to fight this system, everyone who believed that democracy requires transparency, everyone who thought the American people deserve to know what their government does in their name. He represents the conscience that the intelligence community tries to erase through training, through compartmentalization, through the promise of good pensions, and the threat of prosecution. And he lost. His career was destroyed. His life was ruined. The system crushed him and sent a message to everyone else. This is what happens when you choose truth over loyalty. This is what happens when you believe the Constitution matters more than classification stamps. This is what happens when you forget that you serve the institution, not the people. If this investigation into government secrets and the people who try to expose them resonates with you, make sure to subscribe and hit that like button, because what I'm about to reveal in the final section will show you exactly how deep this pattern goes, and why Operation Northwoods might just be the tip of a much larger, much darker iceberg. So what else is hidden in those archives? What other operations were planned, approved, or executed that make Operation Northwoods look like a minor proposal? Let's talk about what we've learned since 1997 and what it tells us about the depth of deception our government is willing to engage in. In 2001, journalist James Bamford published Body of Secrets, a detailed investigation into the National Security Agency. In his research, he uncovered additional details about Operation Northwoods that weren't in the original declassified documents. He found evidence of discussions about staging attacks on the Guantanamo Bay Naval Base using military personnel dressed as Cuban soldiers. He found references to operations that would involve actual American casualties, not just staged events, because real deaths would be more convincing. And he found indications that Northwoods wasn't the first proposal of its kind. There had been others. Earlier false flag operations suggested during the Eisenhower administration, plans that were discussed, refined, and filed away for future use. Think about that timeline. The military was proposing false flag terrorism in the 1950s. They were still proposing it in the 1960s. Kennedy rejected Northwoods in 1962, but the Joint Chiefs didn't abandon the concept. They just waited for a different president, a more compliant administration. And 2 years after Kennedy's assassination, America was at war in Vietnam based on an incident in the Gulf of Tonkin that declassified NSA documents later proved was misrepresented to Congress and the public. The pattern is undeniable. When the military wants war and lacks justification, they create justification. Sometimes through exaggeration, sometimes through manipulation of intelligence, and sometimes, as Operation Northwoods proves, through proposals to commit actual terrorism. The question isn't whether they're capable of it. The documents prove they're capable. The question is whether they've actually done it. We may never know the full answer because the classification system ensures that the most damaging materials remain hidden for decades. Operation Northwoods was classified for 35 years before release. The full details of the CIA's MKUltra mind control experiments weren't revealed until the 1970s, more than 20 years after the program began. NSA mass surveillance programs operated in complete secrecy until Edward Snowden exposed them in 2013. A decade after they started, every time we think we understand the scope of government abuse, new revelations prove we've only scratched the surface. And the surveillance has only gotten more sophisticated. The NSA can now monitor virtually every electronic communication in the world. They track your phone calls, they read your emails, they analyze your social media posts. They know where you go, who you talk to, what you buy, what you search for online. All of it collected, all of it stored, all of it justified under national security. But national security for whom? The American people, or the institutions that want to operate without oversight. When the agent who allegedly leaked Operation Northwoods tried to expose government wrongdoing, he was destroyed. When Edward Snowden revealed unconstitutional surveillance, he had to flee the country. When Chelsea Manning exposed war crimes, she was imprisoned. The government's message couldn't be clearer. We can spy on you, but you cannot watch us. We can keep secrets, but you have no right to know what we do with the power you've given us. We operate in darkness, and anyone who brings light faces consequences. This is the world Operation Northwoods revealed. Not just a world where the military proposed terrorism against Americans, but a world where that proposal was taken seriously, where it was typed up, reviewed, signed, and submitted through official channels, where multiple high-ranking officers thought it was acceptable, where the only thing that stopped it was one man's refusal, one president who said no. And when that president tried to reform the system, when he threatened to break apart the institutions that proposed such operations, he ended up dead in Dallas with questions about his assassination that remain unanswered. 62 years later, you can call that conspiracy thinking if you want. You can dismiss it as paranoia. But Operation Northwoods isn't a conspiracy theory. It's a conspiracy fact. It's a documented proposal by America's military leadership to murder American citizens for political gain. And once you accept that this was seriously considered, once you acknowledge that these people exist in positions of power, you have to ask what else they've considered, what else they've proposed, what else they've done. The archives hold answers. 50 million pages of classified documents in the National Archives alone. Millions more in CIA facilities. Millions more in Pentagon storage. Millions more in facilities so secret that their existence isn't publicly acknowledged. And buried in those millions of pages are operations you've never heard of. Plans that were executed. Secrets that remain protected. Crimes that will never be prosecuted because the evidence is locked away behind classification stamps and security clearances. The agent who tried to expose Operation Northwoods believed Americans deserved the truth. He believed that democracy cannot function without transparency. He believed that the people who grant power to their government have a right to know how that power is being used. And for those beliefs, for that act of conscience, he was silenced. His career was destroyed. His life was ruined. His name, whatever it actually was erased from the story. But the document survived. Operation Northwoods is public now. You can read it yourself. You can see the proposals in black and white. You can see the signatures of the men who approved it. And you can decide for yourself what it means. What it says about the institutions that govern you, what it says about the people who claim to protect you, what it says about the distance between the America you retold exists and the America that actually operates behind closed doors. The agent read Operation Northwoods. His boss silenced him. But the truth got out anyway, not because the system worked, not because transparency prevailed, but because one person was willing to risk everything to make sure you knew what your government had planned, one person who believed that some secrets are too dangerous to keep, one person who understood that without accountability, democracy is just a word on paper while real power operates in shadows. What do you think is still hidden in those archives? What other operations have been proposed that we'll never know about? What has the government actually done that makes Operation Northwoods look tame? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Tell me if you believe the official narratives or if learning about Northwoods changed how you see your government. And if this investigation opened your eyes to how deep government deception goes, leave a like and subscribe to this channel. Because the truth is out there, buried in classified archives and protected by people who believe you're better off not knowing. The CIA archives hold secrets that would shatter your faith in institutions you're taught to trust. Operation Northwoods proved that your government has considered murdering you for political gain. The agent who tried to warn you was silenced, but his act of defiance, his refusal to let this remain buried, gave you the chance to see the truth. What you do with that truth is up to you.